A new McLaren. Now, that's a phrase we've heard quite a lot in recent years, but this, the Artura, well, it really is a new McLaren. It's got a name, not a number, for a start. It's got a new chassis and tub construction, and it's also got a new beating heart. Let's find out a little bit more about it. What's in a name then? Well, Artura. It's an amalgamation of sorts between art and future. Art being what McLaren would like us to think of their new styling, and future chiefly being what's underneath there, because this is a McLaren with an all-new powertrain. The big news is this is the first new McLaren without that venerable twin-turbo V8 that's been a thread really throughout all of McLaren's cars, perhaps arguably almost to a fault. No, this is a hybrid, inevitably perhaps, as we march towards a fully electric future. This car has a twin-turbo V6, again developed for McLaren by Ricardo. It is a 120-degree V6, quite unusual there, with twin-scroll turbochargers mounted within the V. Clearly, it's going to get very hot within the cylinder banks, and hence this rather novel chimney here, which lets the hot air extract out. And in combination with the E-motor, it produces a peak power of 671 brake horsepower and 531 pounds-foot of torque. The engine itself only weighs 160 kilos. The electric motor can contribute up to 95 horsepower and 225 newton-meters of torque. Now, just one thing to be clear on is that peak torque figure is what you get from zero, but it's not what the electric motor is producing when the internal combustion engine is producing its peak torque. So you can't just add the two numbers together. The electric motor is connected to the engine via a clutch, and it's mounted within the drivetrain, so it's not on the rear axle. After that, you have a new 8-speed twin clutch, once again, gearbox. There's no reverse gear because McLaren just used the electric motor to make the car go backwards. And then there's an all-new electronically controlled rear differential as well, which is another first on McLaren. The weight of that V6 is 160 kilos, which actually is considerably lighter than the old V8. But to give you some idea of the challenges that McLaren have inevitably faced, the electric motor, the gearbox, the diff and the clutch, that's another 172 kilos. So you can see how important it has been for McLaren to save kilos throughout the car to try and offset that weight penalty of having a hybrid drivetrain. The design of the Artura sits very much within the McLaren family look. You'll recognise it instantly, I think, as a McLaren. Now, it's not up to me to tell you whether it looks good or not. You'll decide with your own eyes. But the thing that struck me more than anything else was the surfacing and the quality of the surfacing. Now, one reason that partially explains that is McLaren's use of superforming the aluminium panels. It's particularly noticeable on this giant rear clamshell. It's now all one piece effectively, from down the side of the car all the way across the top and to the other side. And the subtlety of the surfaces and the contours is something that you have to see it to really appreciate it. It's a sort of surface that you want to run your hand over to feel the different contours. There's some very sharp creases as well around here. These huge intakes around the side as well are very eye-catching. Incorporating all the hybrid components and crucially putting them in the right places meant that McLaren had no choice but to replace its monocell tub construction. So this car uses what's called MCLA architecture, a new carbon tub built for the first time in McLaren's centre up in Sheffield. And what that has allowed is for them to position key things like the battery and the electric motor exactly where they're required. Now, the chassis itself, or the carbon tub structure, is on the quoted weight slightly heavier than the old monocell, but that's because this time it includes various things like door hinge fixings and where the battery goes, the tray and so forth there. So if you were to compare like for like, we're told that actually the bare tub itself is lighter. The battery is housed right down here behind the front seats. Now that it's for two reasons. Firstly, low centre of gravity, but also it's surrounded by some very strong carbon fibre. So in the event of a crash, it's in pretty much the safest place it could be. Another key point on the Artura is that it breaks that McLaren tradition of using double wishbones all round. On this car, the lower link at the rear is now a multi-link arrangement. McLaren have chased more stability under braking and different tuning opportunities. Overall, this car weighs 1,498 kilos to the DIN standard. That's 46 kilos more than a 570S, and I can almost hear the sigh from here. Yes, it's a pity, it's heavier, it's pretty much on 1.5 tons now. Given the extra technology contained within this car, you have to see that as something of a result. And of course, the hybrid part of the overall package does bring with it lots of benefits as well, not least, we suspect, an explosive torque delivery. Once you're inside the Artura, it's instantly familiar but deceptively different as well. First of all, and this is something that we've applied to McLarens for so long now, but the driving position is absolutely fantastic. I mean, that for me is perfection. The view out, the angle that I'm sitting at, the relationship between me and the wheel, I mean, you just couldn't ask for anything more from a driver's car. And all of this looks very familiar, except clearly this binnacle is nearer the wheel and mounted higher. It's actually mounted on the column now and moves with the column. You've got these switches up here for changing things like the driver's modes, which we'll come on to in a little bit. But the idea is it's this hands-on throttle and stick from the world of fighter jets. And in effect, it means you can keep your hands pretty much on the wheel or very close to it when you want to change some functions. These seats, these are the Club Sport seats. The support feels fantastic already from these, and they feel so comfortable. I get an impression looking around that the perceived quality has gone up a notch. It's a hard thing to talk about, isn't it? And only people that live with cars for months and years and many thousands of miles really know the answer to these sort of questions. But the impression is of more sophistication somehow. The stitching, little bits of detailed design, the way different materials interface with each other. It's just the impression I'm getting. It just seems a bit more of a sophisticated design, and hopefully a better standard of build quality as well. This is a new screen, this 8-inch touchscreen. There's Apple CarPlay and Android now as well. These paddles, again, no one does paddles like McLaren do. Other manufacturers should just look at this and learn. These are even better than I remember from other McLarens. Just the action of them is really tactile. And makes changing gear obviously much more an event. Of course, you haven't got 3 pedals and a stick, but at least if you've got paddles that offer some kind of feedback, you do claw back some of that driver interaction, basically. Predictably, a car of this complexity, the driving experience is dominated by driver modes. They tie in all the different systems. The Artura has 4: E mode, comfort, sport and track. And it's a lot more than just damper settings and engine power. The car will boot up in E mode unless you tell it to do otherwise when you turn the ignition on, which means switch car on, drive away in silence. In that mode, the internal combustion engine won't cut in, even if you stamp on the throttle. It's a 7.4 kilowatt hour battery. Interestingly, it takes 2.5 hours to charge from a normal wall socket, so you don't need any special charger. But then this isn't meant to be a hybrid in the sense of an eco car, clearly. The range is about 19 miles on WLTP. In the real world, whether you get that, who knows? But at least there's something there to play with. The driver modes affect the strategy of how all the systems work together. If you move to comfort, obviously you get the most comfort spec damping from the adaptive dampers, but also the car is very much still in a eco-focus mode where it looks after the battery and tries to keep the battery as topped up as possible. Clearly, if you move to sport, it's much more about power rather than regeneration. And if you go to track, then obviously it's all about ultimate performance. There are two key points to the Artura though, where McLaren has actually stuck with what it does really well. One of which is the steering, which remains hydraulic and not a full EPAS system, which they could have done obviously for a little bit more gains on the consumption. But as we've said many times, McLaren steering is one of the best, if not arguably the best in the business at the moment. And it's great news that they've stuck with that hydraulic setup. The other is that there is no brake regeneration for the battery. It's all done via the electronics and via the engine, putting power back into the battery, which has enabled them not to deal with the thorny question of brake pedal feel when you're using the brakes to regen the battery. So there you have it, the Sports Series McLarens are no more. The Artura sits with the 720S and the 765LT in the supercar column, with the GT and the Ultimate Series on either side. Compared with the 570S, this is 1 mile an hour faster, top end, it's 0.2 quicker to 62, and it's over a second quicker from 0 to 124 miles an hour. So clearly the speed of the car is not in question. And this also seems to be a McLaren with a broader range of abilities as well. The key question now will be whether it can combine that range of abilities with the kind of driver enjoyment and interaction we've come to expect from McLaren.